spell to a misdirection. It's not as good as keeping combo decks honest, but sometimes there can be, force misdirection can be better in certain situations.
So most of the time in Legacy, you see misdirection played as Force of Wills 5 and 6. In this case, he's playing it as Force of Will 4 because you have that added benefit of misdirecting a Thoughtseize, or even better, a Hymn to Torak back on the person casting it.
Right, Hymn to Torak, I think, is a particularly good one that you mentioned there. That card has seen an uptick in play somewhat recently, as with Deathrite Shaman got an uptick. Started seeing a lot of play. A lot of the control decks started playing black, and with more discard, I think we have seen more Hymn to Torak, which certainly makes misdirection, I'd say, a better card, right? Its stock has risen recently.
Yeah. And so the bug decks have moved towards discard as disruption. So we see these two competitors joking with each other, having a good time. While this is serious stakes for both of them, they know each other. Cedric's commented on a lot of Joe's matches. And they're pretty comfortable, and they're going to have a good time here, and we're going to have a good time too. So it looks like they're both contemplating their 7s. I think from the fact that they're not in serious consideration, they're both going to keep, but we'll see what happens.
Because they're both 3-1, they're just going to keep loose hands. No.
That's something that Cedric's certainly capable of. I expect precise play from Joe.
We were right with the splashes. So Cedric's Goblin's deck, fairly standard. His 2 splashes are, he has 1 Plateau for 4 Thalias out of the board, and then he does have 1 Taiga in his deck to activate Tin Street Hooligan.
Yeah, he's got the classic Goblin War Chief Tin Street Hooligan combo in there. So Cedric leads off with a Ether Vial, which is one of the plays that he wants on turn 1. The other one being a Goblin Lackey.
Right. In this matchup, it seems that the Ether Vial is probably more important than the turn 1 Lackey, because Brilliant Miracles is probably is one of the decks that's closer to being a pure control deck in the format. But
yeah.
Ether Vial will really let him cheat around cards like Counterbalance.
So they're both ways to cheat on mana costs and uncounterably get goblins into play. Ether Vial is preferable because Joe can have a Swords to Plowshares to deal with a Mog War Marshal. And we see Cedric play on turn 2 his lone Goblin Pile Driver from the deck.
Alright, so there's only one Pile Driver left in the deck. Cedric also does have the Cavern set on Goblins. So between Ether Vial and Cavern of Souls, there's a pretty good chance that there's some dead cards in Joe's hand at this point.
Yeah, although if Joe had a Force of Will in his hand, he would have forced the Ether Vial. So he could have a Spell Pierce, he could have his 1 of Counterspell in his hand, but those aren't very good in this matchup anyways. So
right, he generally still tries to control creatures through removal spells more than through counter spells.
Yeah. And Cedric's going to play a Matron here, post-combat. It's going to resolve, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
The search does not get stifled. We don't have
there are no stifles in Joe's deck.
Yeah. And we get a Ringleader with that. And so, as you can see, Cedric is building up a board, but he's also making sure that he has a way to refuel his hand. He knows that his creatures are not going to live long, and so he's playing a longer, grindier card advantage game here. And the thing about Goblins in Legacy is that it's not really an aggro deck. It's a really good attrition deck. All of its cards gain you card advantage because they have good effects and they have a 1/1 or a 2/2 attached to them. So
we have an end of turn activation, but nothing actually put into play.
So Cedric is kind of chump checking Joe, I guess, making sure that he doesn't have a Stifle, and potentially he doesn't have a Venser. That doesn't actually matter.
Okay.
Sorry. I was thinking through the interaction of what happens to the Ether Vial if it's destroyed in response.
Right.
Or actually, this is a relevant interaction, whether Joe is going to cast a Vendilion Click in response to the activation of the Ether Vial.
Right, so Cedric's going to cycle the Gem Palm Incinerator at Vendilion Click, drawing into a card. Possibly if he drew into a 3-drop, he'd be able to vial it into play, but was not able to do so.
Yep. And you see that Joe, he knows what he wanted to get. It's that Ringleader. That's why he didn't respond to Cedric vialing at the end of Joe's turn. But he knew that Cedric would be able to play a 4-drop for its actual casting cost this turn, and does not want the ringleader to resolve.
All right, so we have this card's Sting Scourger, Goblin Ringleader, Gem Palm Incinerator, Land, and Tarfire. The Ringleader, I think, the clear choice for Joe to take.
Yep.
Ringleader, which, he managed to get that out of Cedric's hand before Cedric was able to resolve it.
Yeah. And Cedric draws for the turn a Goblin Lackey.
Okay. Draws for the turn, you mean off the...
or off the Vendilion Click, rather. And possibly a slight mistapping of his mana using the cavern to cast the to cycle.
I mean, it seems unlikely that Joe would counter the Goblin Lackey, and indeed he doesn't here.
Yeah.
The Lackey, its ability not particularly relevant here. What it actually does is it just pumps the pile driver.
It pumps the pile driver, and it depends on what Cedric's draws are. Its ability will be relevant if we get another matron or if we hit another ringleader, because you're going to be interested in potentially cheating in 2 goblins in a turn if you're drawing a whole bunch of cards. But for the most part, its relevant ability is it's going to deal 3 more damage per turn. So Cedric's contemplating an attack here. He's going through his hand, and he's got a pretty good clock right now. He doesn't necessarily have to commit any more creatures to the board. Joe goes to Swords to Plowshares. The pile driver accidentally reveals a volcanic island instead, and let's make sure that we get that pile driver actually exiled, and that Goblin Lackey. And so Joe's going to take 1 damage off of the matron, and at this point Cedric's going to want to rebuild a little bit with cards in his hand.
All right. So, yeah, once again, Joe's really just trying to contain it. It seems to me like Joe's trying to contain what Cedric's doing here until he can set up, a more control-ish sort of board. But by getting rid of, the card advantage engine of Cedric, yeah, but by getting rid of, the ringleader is kind of like the main card advantage engine of goblins. Is that right?
Yeah. So the whole matron into ringleader or ringleader into the other goblins is the way that you grind out advantage. You find the perfect card for any particular situation, and each ringleader gets you a 2/2 and draws you 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4 cards. Statistically, it's like 2.5.
And so Cedric has chosen a fairly aggressive play. He plays a Sting Scourger without a target from Joe, simply as a grizzly bear, actually a weaker grizzly bear.
Yeah.
And we see a miracle to entreat the angels from Joe Lossett.
So Joe has revealed the Entreat the Angels, and he's now fetching a response to the trigger so that he can cast it for 2 angels here.
Right, now there is an opportunity, even with miracling, between miracling a card and casting a card, a player gets priority, so that he's able to do this, correct?
Yep. There's the miracle trigger, and then when the trigger resolves is when you get to cast the spell.
So a question, which some might come up, is the Entreat the Angels in his hand yet right now, or is it still on top of that? Where is the Entreat the Angels while this is happening?
It's in his hand. It triggers on you drawing the card, and part of drawing the card is putting it into your hand. So one interesting thing that comes up occasionally in Legacy is if you have a miracle trigger and your opponent has a Vendilion Click, they can actually Vendilion Click away the miracle before you get a chance to cast it.
So we have 2 angels made off Entreat the Angels. Cedric is going to opt to Tarfire one of them, presumably then follow it up with Gem Palm Incinerator.
Yep. So he's going to get to draw a card here, and you can see the card advantage engine here. We have a cycling card. We get to draw a card and deal 2 damage.
Joe passes the turn again. He still has a misdirection in his hand and 2 other cards. Cedric with no cards in hand, but a fairly large board presence.
Yeah. Well, it's 1 card from the cycle. He's paying the upkeep.
So with moving the Ethervial to 4, is that in anticipation of another ringleader?
Yeah, he's at the point with 2 caverns now that all the little things that he would want, he's going to be able to cast uncounterably, and so he just wants to save on mana.
And Joe, flipping another Entreat the Angels right off the top. This one was actually just after a cracked fetch land, so this one was a blind Entreat the Angels.
Yeah.
Making 3 more 4/4s.
Cedric's in a little bit of trouble here, and you can see that on his face when we cut to it before he knows that this game has gone out of his control.
Right. We have actually some interesting art there on Entreat the Angels. It seems that Joe, having been someone who plays the deck a lot, has his own customized angel tokens for his Entreat the Angels.
Yeah, I think the one that's tapped might be from X-Men Archangel, or no, they're just cool altars with wings and stuff.
Of note, the 2 Entreat the Angels are the only 2 Entreat the Angels in Joe Lossett's deck.
That's true. He's happened to get lucky here, but this is why he puts the cards in his deck. And so we saw Cedric push up his Ether Vial to 5 here. That I assume that means that he has a Siege Gang commander in his deck, and
the only 5 he plays is a 1-of Siege Gang.
Yeah, and so he thinks that the way he's going to get out of this is top decking it there and burning his opponent out.
So we have a swing with a Sting Scourger. It seems like Cedric's deck is unable to actually remove 4 angel tokens.
Yeah.
So he's gonna essentially have to be aggroing from this point.
He may have drawn another Tarfire to make this attack. That would make sense why he would have a 1/1. Or he has this Siege Gang commander.
So we do see the Siege Gang commander. There's the tell on the ticking Ether Vial up to 5, but it wasn't off the top of the deck, it was in his hand. So he should be able to finish off an angel here. Yeah. I don't know if this will actually be enough to still get him the game. He's at a 17, which is actually a fairly convenient life total. It's 1 more than Joe's able to swing for.
Yeah, and so next turn he has the potential to kill 1 angel. Cedric would really like another land here to be able to kill multiples. Or if Joe gets a little frisky with the angels, it's possible that Cedric's going to be able to burn him out.
Well, yeah, it does seem by not making a larger attack here, I don't believe Joe can swing 12 here. He'll need a little more control and blockers to make sure that he doesn't get burned out by Siege Gang commander.
Yeah. So if Cedric draws a land here, he can attack for 6 and then burn for 6 more. So Joe needs to leave at least 1 blocker back, otherwise he's leaving himself open to be alpha strike to death.
Joe's hand is Jace the Mind Sculptor, Brainstorm, Joe's Jace the Mind Sculptor, Misdirection, it looks like a land, and I believe a Swords to Plowshares. The Swords to Plowshares seems like should be able to answer the Siege Gang commander.
I agree. It's despite having the dead card in the Misdirection, this is a way for him to even things out, stabilize the board, and assuming Cedric doesn't repeal, the attacking with 2 or 3 angels should be enough to get it done.
And Joe agrees as well. He makes the play, Swords to Plowshare and Siege Gang commander, that puts Cedric back up to 19, and Joe's going to follow up that with Jace the Mind Sculptor.
And bouncing either of the 2 real goblins doesn't accomplish anything positive, and bouncing either of the tokens doesn't do a whole lot, so it's a choice of either Fate Sealing or Brainstorming, and Joe realizes that he's in a stable spot. He just needs to prevent it being peeled on.
Yeah, Joe's going to Fate Seal. He sees the Tarfire on top of the deck, leaves it there. It doesn't particularly, it seems to me here that Joe could win with either Jace or Angel tokens at this point, and that so he's looks like he's opting for a very conservative line of just swinging 1 angel.
Yeah, I think he's planning on killing Cedric 2 turns from now. He's going to attack with a single angel again, and then attack with all 3 angels. Right. This prevents him from losing to like another pile driver.
Now, yeah, he may even play more conservatively like that. Correct me if I'm wrong here, because he would not want to lose to, say, maybe on that final swing he may not want a Jump Home Incinerator to suddenly make it a non-lethal attack. But
that's true, although there's going to be 1 unknown card for that. Wow, that is a good 1 unknown card.
So Ringleader is going to hit Tarfire, Mog War Marshal, 2 lands. So and I love all this part about Legacy. Only a draw 2 off the Goblin.
Yeah. Well, it didn't draw the right 2, so Joe is still in pretty solid position here. The Mog War Marshal is not castable at this point. And it also isn't going to have a big enough impact. It's not going to create a large enough swarm.
Right, so Cedric swings the Goblin Ringleader in. The Tarfire is known about, so he's offering a trade of Tarfire and Ringleader for an Angel token. And unknown whether the ringleader is going at Joe or at Jace. Both probably at Joe, but we're not positive.
I would imagine it's at Joe. It's not super threatening either way.
Yeah, Joe takes it and goes down to 10.
Yeah. At this point, Joe is just sort of preserving his ability to kill Cedric over 2 turns while leaving back blockers for the 1/1s and for top deck.
So when Joe's trying to protect his life total here, let's see, what out of the Goblins deck does he have to protect himself from? A lot of playing Miracles is kind of counting your opponent's outs and taking them away.
So at this point, I think a Siege Gang Commander might still have been an out. Certainly if a Siege Gang Commander had come off that Ringleader, it was a potential out.
Right.
The other outs really are a War Chief and a Pile Driver to get a lethal attack in, and you're able to prevent that by just having blockers back.
There could be a War Chief and a Krenko might be possible. Cedric only plays one Siege Gang, so now that the Siege Gang has been swords, that's no longer a threat. The last large finisher Goblin in Cedric's deck is a Krenko mob boss.
Yeah. Krenko with War Chief would also do it. It would be able to get him up to a total of 14 goblins. That's something that specific sequence I don't think Joe can actually play around. But he is reducing the chances of that by Fate Sealing with Jade Seal and controlling Cedric's draws.
Right. So we see Cedric's hand. It has a pair of lands in it, a Tarfire, a Mog War Marshal, and a pair of Tarfires, a single land, and a Mog War Marshal. So Cedric, realizing he does have Joe at 6 with the 2 Tarfires, trying to find a way to push 6 more damage across it looks, and he's going to go ahead and swing the team to see how much damage he actually can push. To me, it seems likely here that he doesn't have the damage, but he's basically making sure that Joe recognizes that and makes the correct blocks.
Yeah. So if Joe doesn't block at all, Cedric's going to be able to burn him out. But I believe if he blocks even one of the 1/1s, this will be good enough to prevent him from being burned out.
Exactly.
That said, though, Cedric does have the ability to double Tarfire one of the Angels in order to extend his life one more turn.
All right, so Joe's going to make the block. He's going to block, it appears, the Goblin Matron and the Goblin Lackey. Joe doesn't seem to want to get one of his Angels Tarfired here, so he's taking a pretty safe route where he just takes down 2, and so Joe drops down to 6. We know Cedric has 2 Tarfires. I don't think he can have a third one because I believe he already has 2 in his graveyard.
Yeah, so the out that Cedric is playing to now is that Joe attacks with all the Angels, and he's able to double Tarfire one of them to stay alive and leaves himself with lethal creatures on the board, and that Joe has nothing to deal with that.
Cedric tapping the Ether Vial on 5. Cedric has 2 Tarfires. He only actually plays 3 Tarfires, so yeah, there's the 1 in the graveyard and 2 in his hand.
Yeah. But 2 Tarfire is enough to kill an Angel and keep him alive one more turn.
Right, so Joe could make a mistake here. 1 Tarfire, second Tarfire.
There's a misdirection
misdirection and Force of Will are both in Joe's hand. He's going to go ahead and hard cast the Force of Will, and that will be the game. So Cedric taking 12, Joe Lossett gets the first game.
Yeah. So the cue play there would have been to misdirection the Tarfire. I think Joe actually considered that and then decided not to because he didn't want to show.
He didn't want to reveal the misdirection.
But he's going to promptly board it out because it's no good in this matchup.
Right. So in this matchup, why don't we go ahead and start with Cedric? He's the more straightforward deck. The 4 Thalia that he has this white splash for seem to be tailor-made for this matchup.
Yeah, that's a very reasonable card for him to bring in. He's going to be concerned about Joe getting to 4 mana for his Supreme Verdict. Joe only has 1 Supreme Verdict in the deck, but Cedric may believe that he has more. It also, cuts down on the number of Angels that can be created with Entreat the Angels. It delays Jace the Mind Sculptor, and generally just constrains Joe's ability to play the game.
Right. Outside of that, when we look at the rest of Cedric's sideboard, a lot of it appears to be pretty high impact, but narrow but high impact cards. The main deck shell of the deck seems to be pretty powerful, but when we look at his other cards, things like Angel of Despair, Relic of Progenitus, Pyrokinesis, don't really see anything else that would be relevant in this matchup.
Yeah, so when you're looking at a sideboard, the first three things, Thalia, Angel of Despair, Relic of Progenitus, they're all for combo matchups, but they're for different combo matchups. Thalia is primarily for storm-based matchups, but also gains benefit against a control deck like this. Angel of Despair is for the Sneak and Show matchup. Relic of Progenitus is for graveyard-based combo decks. And then the last cards in his
it's the second Tin Street Hooligan.
Yeah, is Tin Street Hooligan and Pyrokinesis, which are for creature matchups. So he has a very focused sideboard that's for specific things. And he's only going to bring in their appropriate cards for each appropriate matchup. On Joe's side, we have a more diversified sideboard. We have 2 blue elemental blasts, 1 pyroblast, 1 red elemental blast, 2 misdirection, 2 rest in peace, 1 Venser Shaper Savant, 1 humility, 1 pithing needle, 1 sulfur elemental, 1 engineered explosives, 1 entreat the angels, and 1 disenchant.
So yeah, of those, the blue elemental blast, obviously against a mono red deck, will be a tool he uses. And then another card, I know a judge's favorite card would be humility, probably in a matchup like this.
So humility is primarily there for the Sneak and Show matchup, but it also is pretty good in the Goblins matchup. It doesn't really reduce the size of any of these Goblins, but Cedric's not playing them for their size, he's playing them for their special abilities, and so being able to keep a ringleader from drawing you 3 cards is a really powerful thing. So I expect him to bring in the humility. I'd also expect the Pithing Needle to come in. It's good against Rashad Import, it's good against Ether Vial, it's good against Wasteland. Joe is usually pretty careful about fetching base, so he doesn't worry a lot about Wasteland, but there are enough targets that I think a singleton Pithing Needle is worthwhile.
How good actually is Pithing Needle against Rashad Import? Say Cedric didn't have other cards like Ether Vials to board in, is Rashad Import a strong enough case for boarding in Pithing Needle?
No. The reason to bring in Pithing Needle is because you want to shut off Ether Vial and maybe Siege Gang Commander. That's primarily if it looks like he has specifically Siege Gang Commander. It's just that it's never a dead card. If Cedric has a non-Ether Vial draw, but he does have a Rashad Import or a Wasteland, Joe is going to be able to name it there and get some value out of it. It's not going to be completely dead.
All right, so then you said he boards out Misdirection in the matchup. Forcible also goes, I imagine?
Yeah, and Forcible is frequently going to be dead between Cavern, Goblin Lackey, and Ether Vial. So you really would prefer not to have that in your deck. But you also would prefer not to have Spell Pierce in your deck and not to have Counterbalance in your deck. So there are a lot of cards that Joe would like to take out. And unlike a lot of Blue-White Miracles decks that have a fair amount of removal on the sideboard, there isn't a ton for him to bring in. So we may see things like Engineered Explosives and Disenchant and Venser Shaper Savant come in from the sideboard simply because they're better than the mostly dead cards in the main.
Right, so we have Cedric on the place when he's starting on an unaired, Cedric on the play starting with Aired Mesa, no Lackey or Ether Vial. Joe will start with Volcanic Island into Sensei's Divining Top, which is kind of, in some ways, Divining Top seems to be the engine of Joe's deck.
It's incredibly important. It provides so much card selection, and it's really key for taking advantage of the miracle mechanic. You don't always hit to entreat the angels on running turns off the top of your deck naturally, and so being able to set up the cheating and putting them at the right time is really, really valuable. And so we see from Cedric that turn 2 Thalia that we talked about, that's really going to pump the brakes on Joe's turns.
Right, the turn 2 Thalia from Cedric is probably the reason why he kept the hand, or the appeal of the hand that he kept here is he didn't have one of his signature 1-drops or a Cavern. How far does this set up? Joe does have a Sensei's Divining Top, and the fact that Thalia is only a 2/1, how far does this Thalia actually set him back?
It's going to act like a Time Walk. It sets Joe back for a full turn. It's not a repeating Time Walk, but everything that Joe would have done on turn 2, he's going to have to do on turn 3. Well,
you need to draw Caracas. So Caracas, of which Joe is playing 2, bounces Legendary Creature, which Thalia does happen to be.
And we see the Krakus in action.
And Cedric's fast on the wasteland for the Krakus, recasts Thalia. So basically, they completely reset the board to last turn.
Yep. So one thing about the keep of the Thalia is because Cedric knows that Joe is probably boarding out most of his counter magic, he can pretty safely keep a hand that's highly dependent on getting the turn 2 Thalia to slow things down.
So Joe has an interesting decision here. He, with his last Divine Top, the top 2 cards of his deck are an Entreat the Angels and a Terminus. So he's kind of riding a couple miracles on the top of the deck. It's interesting because Joe actually does not have a white mana source yet. I mean, he can fetch for one, but that will, he won't be able to carry those miracles on the top of the deck if he does do that.
Yeah, I think that Joe really doesn't care about the Entreat at this point in the game and is mostly concerned about the Terminus.
Exactly.
And so, if he floats that until it's time to cast it, he will be able to fetch in response to the miracle trigger once the miracle makes it into his hand. And he'll lose the Entreat the Angels, but the Terminus he'll cast. But at this point, I think Joe is willing to let things build up a little bit more, continue to float those spells, and allow Cedric to commit a couple more cards to the battlefield.
All right, so we see a third land. It's another volcanic island from Joe. So still with no white source in play, but he's gonna, it does seem like he's trying it all possible to keep this Terminus on top of his deck, so that he can miracle it. Right now, Cedric only has 2 power on the battlefield, so Joe's continuing. Joe decides to basically continue making land drops for the time being.
Yep. And so we have a ringleader here, and we're going to see how well Cedric's running.
Right, and Cedric, 4 lands off the ringleader. You see this big fist pump. More like, yeah, he's super excited. All of them on the bottom of the deck. Cedric with his 2/2 haste crashes in for 4 damage. That'll put.
And we see that Joe is now willing to sacrifice his Sensei's Divine Top to get those guys off of the board. He knows that Cedric doesn't have gas in his hand, and so pulling the trigger on the Terminus now.
Right, so because of that, how the interaction works, he is able to fetch for the white to get Terminus because, but he does give up the Divining Top in the process.
Yeah.
Though Joe's still with a 6-card hand, I think.
Yep, and it's possible that he has another Divining Top in his hand and therefore doesn't mind losing the one that he shuffled away. We'll take a quick look at Joe's hand on his turn and see if we can figure out how he's going to plan out the next couple turns.
Right. So, Cedric now tapped out. Joe's going to get a turn to untap and make a threat. I think Cedric has to be pretty worried, I would say, about the fact that Joe will get to resolve a Jace if he wants to at this point. Now, certainly a Jace on an empty board would be a very difficult thing for Cedric to deal with.
Yeah. So Joe has not drawn a 4th land, so he can't cast the Jace in hand, but he's going to brainstorm and likely find the things that he needs.
Right. So with full grip there, it looks like it appears that he has found his land. Well, he certainly has found a blue elemental blast. He has a hand full of removal, a pair of swords, a blue elemental blast. Maybe I guess I'm not positive if he has his 4th land, but what he does have is plenty of time right now.
That's very true. The Mystic Gate.
Mystic Gate. So a blue-white filter land. Typically, the cycle filter land, something that doesn't see play in Legacy. Mystic Gate, standard in Miracles, or not so much?
So Joe defined the standard for the non-basic, non-dual land a while ago with Glacial Fortress, and he's since switched to Mystic Gate. The reason for this is that some decks play a card called Choke, which is a 2-mana green enchantment that says all islands don't untap.
So this is kind of a way to still get as much blue mana as you need while still under a choke.
Yeah, so if you get choked, it's a 3-mana green enchantment. If you get choked, you can still fetch for basic planes and then use that to filter through the Mystic Gate and get blue mana that way.
So Joe casts a Vendilion Click. He opts clearly to take the Goblin Ringleader from Cedric. It leaves him with a Matron and a Gem Palm Incinerator. So it seems like Cedric still has a lot of, he certainly isn't out of action, but the board's still pretty empty.
Yep.
Cavern on Goblin will play Goblin Matron, and you have to assume that he's getting a Ringleader, and Cedric doesn't even think twice about it.
Yep, so he's just on the grind. He wants to get card advantage, and the shocking thing is that the Goblins deck really can outcard a dedicated control deck like Blue, White, Red Miracles. And a large part of that is that it has a draw engine. The draw engine for Miracles is just Jace. Unlike in Standard, where you have powerful card draw spells like Sphinx's Revelation, in Legacy, Goblin Ringleader is about the best thing that you can do to draw cards.
So Cedric, after making the Goblin Matron, cycles Gem Palm Incinerator to take down the Vendilion Click, draws a card, then passes the turn. And Joe is going to opt to, while the board is still relatively clear, resolve Jace the Mind Sculptor.
Yeah. I'd imagine that he's going to brainstorm here.
Yeah,
that's
he does.
What happens.
It seems like seems like right now one of Joe's main concerns is to just continue hitting land drops.
Yeah, and so he was hoping to hit on that, a land that would allow him to cast Swords to Plowshares, that would allow him to keep the Jace alive for an additional turn. I'm not sure if he actually hit a fetch land. It looks kind of like he didn't.
I don't believe he hit a land at all.
Yeah. So Cedric's going to be able to kill the Jace here.
Cedric has drawn what appears to be a Siege Gang commander. There's a worry, I think when you see Cedric here, and Cedric's probably very aware of this, when his opponent is, has brainstormed as many times as Joe has, and still continues to, not hitting lands, you have to assume that Joe's hand has a lot of control cards in it.
Yeah. And so Cedric, realizes how important the Jace is happy to quote-unquote waste a mana by not casting a 5 in order to get the Jace off the board.
So Cedric, what he does is casts Goblin Ringleader, which, only hits one. Cedric's running a little below average on his Goblin Ringleader. He hits a Matron, attacks the Jace down off the board, and then he wastelands the Mystic Gate, passing the turn.
Yep. And he knows from the fact that Joe brainstormed with Jace that the top two cards are not lands.
So it seems like, is it fair to say that right now, because Cedric knows that Joe has so much game in his hand, that Cedric's going to try to, wasteland and reach it and port his way ahead in this game?
I think that's the primary way that Cedric finds a victory here is, continue to constrain Joe's resources and keep creating threats as Joe deals with them and just have constant small pressure on the board while constraining Joe's ability to deal with it.
Right, so Joe, no play at all, draws a card. Remember, this card he knows, and he knows the next card as well, also not a land.
Yeah.
Cedric with land number 6, his hand is Goblin Warchief, Goblin Matron, and Siege Gang Commander. He's going to opt to just swing with these two creatures, which is rather interesting because he has the Warchief in hand. It seems like what Cedric's going to try to do is Matron into another Ringleader.
Yeah, so I think what Cedric may have been thinking there is that Joe is telegraphing that he has something. One of the things that he can have is the Swords to Plowshares, and Cedric would much rather have Joe Swords to Plowshares.
He's trying to bait their moves. Yeah. Joe on the block played a Vendilion Click. Vendilion clicking himself, getting rid of it looks like getting rid of a Swords to Plowshares. The Vendilion Click traded with Ringleader, and Cedric responds then with another Goblin Matron, presumably finding yet another Ringleader, and there one is.
Card advantage, card advantage, card advantage. When you have, up to 8, draw 3, get a 2/2, that's pretty good in your deck. And I think Cedric's going to pass the turn here, and he's going to go ahead and he's going to port Joe.
So it actually was not, it was not a Swords to Plowshares on the bottom of the deck. It was a different white bordered white card. It was a Disenchant that was put on the bottom. So an upkeep, Cedric is porting the white mana.
Yeah.
Joe, however, still at 16,
Yeah. Well, Cedric is not an aggressive deck. He, is grinding out a slow advantage. Joe manages to top deck the land that he needed and has been looking for.
Right. He finds the Arid Mesa. I don't believe he has any. He may have one Brainstorm left, but either way, the fact that it's a fetch land should take care of most of his mana issues.
That's true, and getting another white source here is of paramount importance because it makes all of his terminuses live now where they weren't before because the other white source is getting
with
ported.
Cavern, Cedric casts Goblin Ringleader. He finally gets a Goblin Ringleader of more than one card. This one will be Goblin Matron and Gem Palm Incinerator. I would expect the Matron to find the last Ringleader at some point here. Unless he has a kill.
I would expect so too, although probably next turn. I think Cedric is kind of committed to the porting plan right now.
Right. All right, so we see a Brainstorm from Joe Lossett. Because he has the uncracked fetch land, this is quite strong. He finds a couple more lands, a Force of Will.
And seeing the basic planes off of the Brainstorm is particularly nice for Joe, because it means that his white sources will not be wastelandable, and he's going to be able to make his Entreat the Angels live even through the port.
Right, so Joe Lossett plays 2 planes in his deck, presumably for the purpose of being able to make sure that he can't get wastelanded off and treat the Angels.
That's right. He also plays, I believe, 3 or 4 islands. 4 islands in his deck. So, he's very concerned about being able to operate through mana denial from his opponents.
So just note, he doesn't have a basic mountain.
No, well, so the red splash is purely for sideboard cards. It's for the Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast in his sideboard, and that's mostly for other blue-white decks that he doesn't expect to be wastelanding him.
Sure, and he's not running any Blood Moons, is that correct?
I don't believe so. Yeah, the only other red card in his sideboard is a Sulfur Elemental.
Okay.
You do see in a lot of blue-white-red Miracles lists a red splash for a Blood Moon in the main deck, and those lists are the ones that are using Helm of Obedience and Rest in Peace and Energy Field in the main deck as ways to lock out your opponent and serve as a win condition.
So Joe kept a Pithing Needle. Pithing Needle will be played naming Rishadan Port. Joe really seems, this play speaks of keeping his mana. He's just keeping his mana sources free.
Yep. He realizes that Cedric's plan has been to keep him casting one spell a turn, and slowly chip away at him, and that's locked Joe out of using his large hand so far. But Joe's going to be able to unlock it now and start dealing with Cedric's threats as fast as Cedric can cast them.
Cedric's hand, however, with many cards in it. He has Ether Vial, War Chief, Incinerator, and I think a whole other slew, a Goblin Matron, and I believe a couple other goblins. At some point here, Cedric's going to be able to just haste the entire team.
Yeah, he may be waiting for Joe to tap out to do something like War Chief, Matron, get Pile Driver, combo kill you.
Right.
Which,
the worry there would be that Joe would Swords the War Chief so that the attack couldn't happen that
Swords
turn.
the War Chief or the Pile Driver, or have a Terminus floating. Although he doesn't have a way to do that now that the Sensei's Divine Top has gotten shuffled away.
Right, so first Goblin War Chief is cast by Cedric, which Joe will Blue Elemental Blast.
Yep. It's a removal spell, but it's also a counter spell. And in this case, it's better as a counter spell because it prevents the cost reduction.
Yep, and another War Chief. This one gets to resolve. Joe's going to go ahead and Swords it. So Cedric's still able to get in 4 damage. Interestingly enough, this means Cedric is going to have some free reign to resolve more Matrons.
That's absolutely true, although he's only got 1 Ringleader left in his deck. So the card advantage train will be coming to an end at some point. So Joe draws an island for the turn, and he has a much diminished hand now. I believe he has 1 more Swords to Plowshares.
He has
Plains.
1 Swords left. He has a Plains, so he plays the Plains for the turn. On 5 mana, he's going to go ahead and just cast Entreat the Angels, making a 4/4. So he's going to play Air Elemental. Had he waited a turn, so interestingly enough, he chose not to wait a turn and make 2 Angels there.
So his life total is dropped enough that if he waits a turn, he actually gets aggroed out because he takes 4 more damage, goes down to 3, and is probably dead to most haste creatures. Cedric at this point, though, is going to be able to play a Goblin and then cycle the Incinerator, and the only thing he's thinking about is whether he can afford to play 2 Goblins and play around a Swords to Plowshares.
It looks like Cedric does have him pretty close to dead. Is it fair to say in this matchup, because of the sheer card advantage that Cedric was able to generate, that while Joe's a control deck, eventually he has, so there's some control decks, every control deck has a dragon or a finisher in it. I'll call it a dragon. At some point in these matchups, Joe has to Miracle and Entreat because he can't just actually control the game forever. It seems like Cedric is able to pull out of that control range.
That's very true. So Joe needs to either land and protect a Jace the Mind Sculptor or Miracle and Entreat at some point. Just hitting Terminus after Terminus after Terminus is not going to be enough against this particular creature deck because it's so card advantage focused.
Right. I've always said one of the fun things about Legacy is, that the mono red deck has more card advantage than the blue control deck.
Absolutely.
Probably the only format where that statement gets to be true.
And it's crazy that cards like Fact or Fiction are legal in this format, yet are not good enough to play.
Right, well, they aren't 2/2 hastes. In addition to being a fact or fiction, I think that's the real,
Well,
what we're seeing here. That's the problem with them.
That, or you don't have demonic tutors for them, and you can't cast them uncounterably or for free.
I suppose a couple of those matter as well.
Yeah. So Cedric plays a single goblin and then cycles the Gem Palm Incinerator.
So we see the fourth goblin, and Joe in response was attempting to swords it to keep his angel alive, and in response to that, Cedric cycles a second Gem Palm Incinerator. This will knock Joe down to 3 life on the attack. Cedric will get 2 cards off this.
So Joe actually Swords to Plowshare the 2/2 haste, so it's only going to be 2 damage.
Sorry, only 2 damage. Thank you. So Joe's at 5, currently facing an army of goblin matrons.
Listen, those ladies are tough, and Cedric, is in pretty good position with Joe drawing just another.
Well, he should have enough with 7 lands to play Siege Gang Commander uncounterably, and then sacrifice a goblin for the last 2 damage.
That's right.
He's going to instead play Ringleader uncounterably, and this Ringleader, hits 2, it's okay, and gets a concession. The player's going to game 3, a little bit low on time. Does that favor Cedric?
I think it actually may favor Joe. And there's certainly fast draws that the Goblins deck can have.
Right. Lackey, boom.
Yeah. But most of the matches that Goblins win, and most of the games that Goblins wins against these blue-white decks are really grindy like that.
So you'd say this is a stereotypical Goblins win against a blue deck.
Yeah, it really is. And it looks a lot like this versus Stoneforge Mystic decks too, although it tends to be a little bit shorter because they just have less removal, less answers. And so there... it isn't often that Joe is going to hit a early miracle and treat the angels, but that's one of the faster ways that this game gets decided. I think there's probably like a 30% chance that this last game actually ends up in a tie. And then I'd say the rest of the time, Joe's probably a little favored, but most of that 30% where it ends up in a tie, Cedric was going to win.
Okay. Do either players, because of the time constraint, is there any way that either players can modify their deck's sideboard, to give themselves a faster win con?
So it's possible that Cedric sideboarded out his Goblin Pile Driver, and if he did, he brought it back in. The Pile Driver is mostly in the main deck as a way to deal with combo decks and just have a very fast clock that can...
Right. Against something like pressure. Storm, Cedric's a pretty big underdog, right?
Yeah, he's a pretty big underdog against Storm and against all of the fast combo decks.
He has 4 Angel of Despair for show and tell based combo decks, but once again, it seems like there will be decks like Storm and to a point, Elves, lots of things that maybe not Elves because he has a lot of removal, but there are some combo decks that he really doesn't have many ways to interact with.
And so having the one Pile Driver in the main deck sort of gives him an out in the first game against these decks before he can bring in his appropriate sideboard cards to be able to Misa win. And because he has 4 demonic tutors, he can do that very quickly. But aside from that, I don't think the sideboard is going to change for Cedric, and I doubt it will change for Joe either.
All right. Both players now on their opening hands. Both on 7s. First decision will be to Joe, as he lost that game 2, the long game 2. Both players keeping, so I think we'll go ahead and start out. Joe on an Arid Mesa, and Cedric with a Goblin Lackey. This could be one of those fast hands you were talking about, right?
Yep. If this goes unanswered, Cedric's going to have a board state very quickly, but I'm pretty sure Joe's
going to like an end-step Swords to Plowshares will take care of that. So, sit back. It's going to be a little bit of a grind.
Yeah. And you see Joe, playing for the long game, saying, I'm going to get basic planes and make all of your wastelands dead draws for as long as possible.
All right. So, Cedric up to 21, not a particularly relevant number. And Joe will get to go ahead with the second blade. He's drawn a Blue Elemental Blast, starting the game out on basics, and passes back the turn, which Cedric on a Reshit Import will upkeep tap the blue mana. Both players do appear to have sped up the pace a little bit. Joe missed his 3rd land draw.
Yeah. Now these guys both know what it's going to take to finish this game in time, and they both know that a draw knocks them out of contention. So they are both incentivized pretty heavily to get things done quickly.
So only a little bit of a hiccup there as Joe hit his land on the next turn. So Joe with the Misty Rainforest, Cedric cracking fetch land, this time getting a Plateau, possibly indicating he has a Thalia in hand, though he may just be getting that in case he draws a Thalia.
Yeah. And he does not have to worry about Joe having wasteland, so it makes sense for him to fetch his non-basics whenever possible.
On the untap, so Cedric with a little more of a disruptive hand. His hand appears to be just full of ringleaders. He's going to go ahead and pass the turn, and it looks like double Rishid Import, or only single Rishid Import on the blue mana.
I think he's checking to see if Joe's going to brainstorm and fetch in his upkeep before porting the other one.
And if that did happen, then he was going to port the second blue source.
Yeah.
Joe, on all basics, really protecting himself from 4 wastelands, does fetch out another island.
And Cedric has a second opportunity to port before the main phase during the draw phase if necessary.
Actually, Joe will just go ahead and take care of all the mana for him. It'll be Vendilion Click. And he's going to get rid of his own Entreat the Angels. You know, we're still a long ways away from that. Joe will draw into what appears to be a Swords to Plowshares.
Yep. And hopefully Joe will remember to draw for the turn. Yep, of course he does.
And he hits his 4th land, a Flooded Strand. So kind of getting himself out from under these Rishid Imports, fortunately with these land draws.
Yeah. And so we've got
Cedric
a blue
was
elemental blast.
unstepped. It looks like unstepped Cedric is going to port the fetch land, which Joe's going to have to fetch now. It's good because it forces a fetch, I believe, because otherwise Cedric would have the option of wastelanding the fetch land if he had one.
Yeah, it's forcing Joe to make his brainstorms in the future a little bit worse, and it doesn't cost Cedric anything to do that.
Yeah, very few instants in Cedric's deck, so when he kept up the second mana for the second port, Joe probably knew that a port was coming at some point there.
Absolutely.
Cedric with a full grip, he hasn't actually, since his Goblin Lackey, has not committed a creature to the board yet.
Yeah, and I think he's probably at the point that he needs to start doing things. Joe has a clock on him, and has been able to develop his mana base sufficiently that Cedric can't really play the waiting game anymore.
Yeah. Wasteland will come down for that Tundra that Cedric forced Joe to get. Joe's floating a mana off it, probably white. Possibly blue, I suppose, if he has the brainstorm. And really wants
Cedric
to find that land.
Might be playing around a spell snare. I'm not sure if he's, presumably he went to second main phase before casting this Matron.
No longer wanting to Rishid Import, Cedric goes with Goblin Matron. It'll be interesting to see what he searches up here. He's going to go ahead and get Tarfire with it, getting rid of the Vendilion Click. Cedric already has a pair of Ringleaders, so while we saw him search for all Ringleaders last game, he elected to get the removals.
Yeah. So in this case, Cedric knows that his game plan based on his hand has to go long, and he wants to make sure that Joe is not able to pressure that. Additionally, he wants to make sure that the worst outcome for him is that there is a draw here, and by protecting his life total, he makes sure that there isn't some sort of miracle Vendilion Click gets there and is really locking Joe down to just the Entreat the Angels.
Is it reasonable that Joe would win the game without Entreat the Angels in this matchup?
Probably not. We're talking about like a 5% chance, 10% chance that Vendilion Click gets there if Cedric doesn't take care of it right there. But I think Cedric is just playing for those small proportions.
So Cedric attempting to become the aggro deck here. He goes for Goblin Warchief. That gets Swords to Plowshared by Joe. Joe also with a pair of blue blasts in his hand. So he's going to be able to dig into a little bit of a late game here.
Cedric also knows that the Vendilion Click retards his ability to be on the aggressive by blocking a key creature like a War Chief.
Right, it's just another kill spell, essentially. Yeah. So Ringleader draws the first blue blast out of Joe's hand. Cedric plays a 6th land, upkeep ports blue, swings 1, Joe's down to 16. Joe still stuck on 3 lands, a handful of a lot of removal, but not too much else. He does draw Divining Top for the turn.
Cedric untaps, and he's got a parade of guys.
Now a little bit. I think he's going to go for this Ringleader. The question is he's going to be, I think, a little disappointed. He's going to eat another blue elemental blast there. No, he doesn't. The Ringleader resolves, only hits 1 Goblin War Chief, and Cedric's going to swing for 3.
But Cedric now has an actual clock on his
Right.
opponent, and he's potentially going to be able to drop a War Chief next turn and start putting
There
more
was the
cards
option
to
there for Cedric to port pre-combat the island and then play a post-combat ringleader to play around Blue Blast, but he opted not to do that. Is the damage just too important here?
I'm not sure what his porting strategy is right now, especially since he chose not to port during that turn.
Right, and that gives Joe, because he didn't port, that gives Joe the opportunity to resolve Humility. So Cedric with only 1/1s in his deck now.
Yeah. Cedric doesn't really have an answer to that. It's going to make winning a lot harder, but at the same time, it's going to be very hard for Joe to win in time either. So this is where we're headed towards that draw situation we talked about.
It's a question I know that a judge loves to answer. Okay, this is just as a casual player, are there any cards in Cedric's deck that are not complete 1/1s under Humility?
The Gem Palm Incinerators still do something. All the creatures that are in play
are still goblins.
So
when he cycles, you can still cycle the Incinerator, but when you cast it, it's a 1/1.
That's correct. I don't believe there are any other goblins in his deck that are going to have an effect other than being a 1/1. And so Cedric at this point is going to want to port as much as possible and cast as many spells as possible.
Humility, an innocuous looking enchantment that ended up causing entire pages of the rulebook to be written. Basically, the idea is simple. All creatures are 1/1s. And for the most part, the execution is simple. There are a couple interactions which are kind of funky with it.
Yeah.
But
it's one of those cards that it's very easy for you to understand just looking at it,
what it's
but
trying
to actually make it work within the rules required a lot of plumbing.
Right. So Cedric commits another 1/1 to the board, and end step and a Divining Top by Joe. So it seems like he's just playing for the draw here.
And that's all he's capable of playing for here, and he's not playing at any slower pace. In fact, I think he's playing at a faster pace than normal because he doesn't want to cheat anybody out of anything. But the win for him is a draw.
We're just considering Tin Street Hooligan also has no interaction with Humility. Is that correct?
That's correct.
It still enters the battlefield trigger.
Yeah, all the things that would trigger on entering the battlefield, like that, or Siege Gang Commander, or Ringleader, have no text and don't do anything.
Cards like, what is it, Mishra's Factory, though, is a 2/2 under Humility, correct?
Yes, and that's because the effect that turns it into a creature has a later timestamp than Humility, and they're applying the same layer. So one is trying to set something to a 1/1, one is trying to set it to a 2/2.
So basically, because the card says no, make it a 2/2, and that precedence. With how layering works, that's the last thing
that's what happens for the power and toughness. But Humility still removes all the abilities from it, so you can't
it can't
tap
pump
it.
itself.
You can't pump itself, and it can't tap for mana either. Once you animate
it, okay, because it's a creature and that's an ability.
Yeah,
even though it's still a land. Lovely. Okay. So Cedric just continuing to commit creatures to the board. He has Joe down to 7. If Joe can Miracle a Terminus, Cedric really has no chance at this. Turn 1 is going to be, it appears that was turn 0, so Joe's going to have turns 1, 3, 5. Cedric has 2 turns to swing. He actually looks like he has a lethal on board here. Granted, Joe only takes a couple removal spells.
Unfortunately, Joe has Entreat the Angels on the top of his library, I believe.
Entreat the 1/1s.
So we're going to get 3 1/1s here, which should be enough to just bring the tie.
Yeah, it was 3 1/1s there.
This actually happened in Joe's upkeep. Cedric ported one of the lands in response. Joe tapped it for mana
Joe to
and then
burn
flipped the top.
Yeah. Cedric cycles Gem Palm Incinerator at one of the 1/1s. Not a great out, but if Cedric, I think what he's thinking is if he can runner enough Gem Palm Incinerators, he might still be able to swing for lethal.
Yep. And so one benefit Cedric gets is he doesn't have to pay the echo on the why can't I remember its name? That's on the Sting Scourger, because it doesn't have that ability.
Mm-hmm. So Cedric, for 3, is going to be able to cast another 1/1. The key cards to him, to me, seem to be Gem Palm Incinerators and Tarfires right now. So the only cards that still do something.
Tarfire is huge because it can actually go to the face.
And Cedric
passed the turn, which
turn.
Is a little curious. I would have thought that he would just offer the trade for 2 of his guys and get in for 2 more damage there. It's possible that he just had a sort of mental misclick and still thought of the Angels as 4/4s.
Yeah, at this point, maybe. Yeah, it seems strange that he wouldn't make the attack here. I would agree.
And so if he had made the attack, he would have gone in 2 damage, put Joe to 5, and then this turn, which is turn 4, he could have attacked for 3, and Tire Fire would be a live draw. Although, quite possibly, Tire Fire got sided out. It's pretty bad in this matchup.
Well, we did see Tire Fire's game 2, is that right?
I believe we only saw them in game 1. That was the one that we had all the Entreat the Angels, and all 3 of the Tar Fires showed up. It's possible we saw one in game 2, but the game 1 was the one with 3 Tar Fires showing up.
So Cedric with another 1/1 doesn't make it doesn't make another token.
Yeah, don't have to pay the upkeep. And I think Cedric would realize that he miscounted and could have gotten in damage there.
Yeah, he could have gotten in 2 damage last turn and then 4 damage this turn. It still would only put Joe to 1 instead of 0. So it seems like these 2 players are headed for a draw.
Yeah.
All right. So both players now at 3-1-1. A tough road to top 8. They're gonna have to win out and maybe hope some breakers go their way.
Yeah, it's certainly still possible that they could make top 8 with that record. But it's pretty implausible, right?
Well, yeah. Well, as we saw yesterday, we had our round